All right. Remember last week that I had mentioned that I was going to do mini features, like maybe two or three smaller features on some episodes? Well, you know how things change on a dime. So this episode is one massive feature on author Hilary Waugh. And I've spent some time recently on a few of his books, and I'm just really liking this guy. He's got a lot of interesting tidbits in regards to his career and his life, and he's got a great body of work. So let's jump into a feature on Hilary Waugh. So Waugh, he was born on June 22nd, 1920, in New Haven, Connecticut. I was just there a few days ago, which I'm going to talk about on my next episode. I did a New England book experience, but I'll talk about it later. He attended Yale University in 1942, and he majored in art. It was at Yale that Waugh enlisted into the U.S. Navy Air Corps, and he went on to serve in the Panama Canal Zone for 2 years, flying different types of aircraft. Like so many other authors that we talk about, serving in the military, Hilary Waugh wrote his first book, and it was a book called Madam Will Not Dine Tonight. It was published in hardcover in 1947. It was later reprinted as If I Live to Dine in 1949. This was the first of three novels starring a New York private eye named Sheridan Wesley. The other books were Hope to Die in 1948, which we mentioned last episode as published by Handy Books. And he also finished out the series with The Odds Run Out in 1949. So those three books were Waugh's first writing efforts, and all three star private eye Sheridan Wesley. I've never read these books, but I've heard that they're just not that good. They probably clearly display an author honing his craft sort of at the beginning of his career. Waugh described them himself as three private eye, cute young couple novels. Now, at that time, he also wrote a story called Mr. Airplane, and it was in Argosy's September 1951 issue. He also appeared a couple years later in that same magazine with a story called Ordeal of the Peter Tin. So in 1949, Waugh reads a true crime book. It's the book called They All Died Young, written by a gentleman named Charles Boswell. And this book, it featured 10 true crimes, and one of them really affected Hilary Waugh. One of them was about a college girl who went missing in Stamford, Connecticut, at Bennington College. So Waugh, reading these true crime events in this book, he decides that he's going to incorporate those elements into a fictional mystery novel, and that book was called Last Seen Wearing. Seen, S-E-E-N, Last Seen Wearing. His fiancée at the time was attending a women's college, so Waugh decided to place his new mystery novel in a fictional college. After working on the book for a couple of years, it finally saw completion and publication in 1952. It was originally published as a hardcover by Doubleday, but this book is often considered the absolute prototype for the modern police procedural novel. It takes place chronologically with time narrated from March 3rd, 1950 until April 11th, 1950. And I'm going to refer to this style in just a few moments, but this book, Last Seen Wearing, put Hilary Waugh on the map as a real heavy hitter of mystery and crime fiction. In fact, this book was featured in a glossy mainstream magazine. Cosmopolitan ran this book in their March 1952 issue. So that was big exposure for the author. And from this point, man, he really gets rolling. He's got his standalone novels next, which is called A Rag and a Bone, followed by these books, The Case of the Missing Gardener, Rich Man, Dead Man, The Girl Who Cried Wolf, The Eighth Mrs. Bluebeard. These were all published up until 1958. The one book that I mentioned, The Case of the Missing Gardener, he used a pseudonym for that book, probably because he was so prolific during this short period of time. So he used a pseudonym of Harry Walker to write that book. Now we'll talk a little bit about Hilary Waugh's pseudonyms in a little bit as well. But at this point, Waugh wants to revisit the series idea again. He had those 3 books that made up his first series, so he wants a new series. So he creates a character in 1959. The character is Fred Fellows. And I've got a lot to say about this fellow. So Fred Fellows is the chief of police in this small, fictitious city of Stockton, Connecticut. He's got a wife named Cecilia, and he's got 4 teenage children, 2 sons, 2 daughters. Listen, Fred only drinks his coffee with sugar and milk. He chews tobacco, and I'm not kidding. His bulletin board in his office is like covered with nude pinups. But it's weird to say that because he's actually a really classy guy. Seriously, he doesn't like come across as a guy who even chews tobacco and looks at nudie mags. And sometimes I think that maybe it was the other men in the station that put the nudes on his wall, because Fred, he always sort of just dismisses that wall when people come in. He's also got a really, really messy desk, but he says he like prefers that way because he can find things easier with his messy desk. At one point, one of his men pokes fun at him because he's got like this trivial receipt from buying pencils or something 3 years earlier that's still sitting on his desk. But Fred just says he may need the receipt someday, so he kind of hangs on to it. But Fred Fellows, his police force includes 20 officers that are kind of like a combination of full-time and part-time. So he's got volunteers sort of thrown in there too, just depending on, I guess, the season. But the key characters to remember with this series, other than Fred Fellows, the key characters are Detective Sergeant Sidney Wilkes, as well as Sergeants Unger and Gorman. But Wilkes is his right-hand man, and often the two of them make up a lot of the dialogue of the books, because the two of them conduct the majority of the investigations. Fellows and his force, they sometimes work with the nearest big city, which is Bridgeport, Connecticut. Stockton is fictitious, as I mentioned earlier, but Bridgeport obviously is a real city. I think there's an actual city that's, I can't remember the name of it, but it sounds like Stockton, and it's right on the coast, but I can't remember the name of it. But I think that he was using that city as sort of a template for Stockton, Connecticut. But anyway, sometimes fellows will have to go into other small towns across the state, trying to track down like witnesses or suspects, things like that. But anyway, most of it takes place right there in that little tiny town of Stockton. So let me tell you briefly my experience with the Fred Fellows series. I'm going to start with the debut book, which was Sleep Long, My Love, published in 1959. What you need to know about this one is the way it is written. First, it has a dragnet-style time system. So each chapter is the date and time. So, like, for example, it'll be like August 3rd, for example, at 2 o'clock to 3:30. The next chapter may be August 3rd, 4 o'clock to 4:30, same day. The reason is that 98% of the book, the reader is right beside Fred Fellows the whole time. I felt like when I read these books, I'm just in the room with Fred at all times. So 98% of the book is from Fred's perspective. You're right there with Fred. Every interview, every crime scene, every command the reader is involved in, which I think is cool. It's in the third person, but Waugh doesn't leave Fellows out of anything. In this book, just the first few pages involve someone other than Fellows. In this way, it puts the reader on the case. As Fellows finds evidence and answers, the reader can decipher these same clues for themselves. And, I mean, that is mystery writing anyhow, right? Kind of riding along with the author and starting with a murder and then kind of working your way down to the final solution, the resolution to the murder. I used a little notepad to write down the clues and the suspects. And, I mean, it wasn't like a heavy lift or anything like that. I mean, it's not a chore. I just did it to sort of keep track of some of the suspects. In a way, it kind of sort of made me feel like I was the police officer handling it. But I had like a little notepad that I was using. But from reading Waugh's nonfiction book on writing, which is called Hilary Waugh's Guide to Mysteries and Mystery Writing, which he put out later in his career, just kind of recapping books that he felt were influential into his career and how to write crime fiction. So in that book, he acknowledges that the first mystery writer to have a professional policeman as the main character was Lawrence Treat, his book called V as in Victim, which was published in 1945, followed by a sequel called The Big Shout, using those same characters. While he says Treat was the first, he doesn't necessarily say he's the father of the police procedural. That recognition would mean a host of other writers were inspired to follow Treat's lead, and that didn't really happen. Treat was even quoted as saying that one time that he didn't even know he was writing police procedurals until someone invented the term and said that was the kind of thing he was writing. But Hilary Waugh says the father of the procedural is probably the program Dragnet, which makes sense. It created the field. Dragnet was vastly popular, huge radio show. I remember watching it as a kid on TV in syndication. I remember watching the old TV show. And when it comes to the police procedural, Hilary Waugh says that genre represented the second major change in the nature of the mystery story, since it achieved really its whodunit form with the advent of the classical detective story. This invention, which established the classical period in the whodunit form, was the shifting of the reader's role from that of observer, like, for example, Watson watching Sherlock Holmes, to that of the participant standing at the detective's side, trying to beat him at his own game. The detective is matching wits with the criminal, while the author is matching wits with the reader. Hilary Waugh says the first change in the handling of the mystery story was in the 40s and 50s, with the story emphasis from thought to action. The detectives were loners trying to save their clients, and sometimes even themselves. Later, they became spies with different sets of problems. So Hilary Waugh says that the police procedural changed all of that. The procedural thrust the detective into the middle of a working police force, full of rules and regulations. The detectives can't really bypass the police because they are the police. It takes the reader into the police department and displays how it operates. So a big difference, right? You go from, like a smoky office where you've got the detective and he's got like a sexy receptionist, and he's bypassing the police to solve crimes. And normally with these detectives, they normally had like one police officer or chief of police or something that they use as an ally, but most of the time they have to circumvent the law to figure out the mystery. But with this, it's really putting the reader right there into the working development of everything with the police force. So I love what he's saying there, how different it is. And really, it's simple. It's how Waugh quoted it. It's the business of moving towards the police instead of away from the police. And that was a radical shift in the character of the mystery story. So for me personally, the police procedurals are realism versus like suspending disbelief, which is something Waugh touches on as well in his book. But anyway, back to Hilary Waugh's Fred Fellows series of police procedurals. His debut, Sleep Long, My Love. In that book, the story involves Fellows and Wilkes finding a human torso in a trunk tucked away inside an abandoned rental house. I read this and I was like, what? This is crazy for that time period. In that book, they have like this, it's like a rental house, and inside they find human bones in the fireplace and furnace. I mean, like really kind of an edgy thing. The torso has the limbs hacked off, and there are signs that something was being cut up in the bathtub. I mean, this is 1959 for God's sake. So, I mean, this is pretty edgy. It's very modern. So the case is, who is the dead woman? Because they don't have a head, so they have no way to get teeth records. There's no dental records to really access. There's no hands for fingerprints. So the mystery is, who's the victim, but also, obviously, who's the killer? So pretty cool little crime, double feature, if you will. Victim and murderer need to be found. So the case winds through the typical interviews, little pieces of evidence, and it's really cool because the tiniest little clues here and there create a path to eventually solving the case. And it was just awesome to be involved in it as a reader, just working with Fred and Wilkes through all these suspects and clues and things like that. Waugh's writing, it's almost tutorial, which I think was sort of like the spin he took with Last Seen Wearing. Waugh gets the police procedure, he understands it. This book was adapted into a British film called Jigsaw, and I was poking around online. Even Pan, which is a British publisher, they published a paperback version of the book as Jigsaw. And just like his Last Seen Wearing book, this book, Sleep Long My Love, appeared in the October 1959 issue of Cosmopolitan, so big time exposure. Waugh's next book in the series is Roadblock, published in 1960. It's the second Fred Fellows installment. I reviewed it a while back, and you don't need to know anything about the first novel to read this. And I believe most of the series works that way. You don't necessarily have to read the prior book. You can just pick them in any order. But Waugh does a little something different with Roadblock. The entire first half of the book is the crime. Fred Fellows isn't even involved in the first half of the book. It's just the criminals. That's the only perspective is just the criminals. And the reader sees the crime happen, knows where the criminals have gone in hiding, and then in the book's second half, it switches completely to just Fred Fellows and the police. The criminals, you don't get anything from the criminals' perspective in the second half. You just get Fellows and the police trying to figure out where the criminals are and trying to solve the case. The first half is about these criminals that knock off a payroll truck at a local factory, and then they go scrambling to a planned hideout. And then the second half of the book is literally roadblocks. This is Fred Fellows setting up roadblocks all through town and then on the outskirts of town. So lots of roadblocks, lots of car chases and things like that. So, I felt like this was the first Fred Fellows book I had read, and I didn't really get it. I liked it just fine, but it didn't impress me that much. In fact, it's kind of like a getaway type story that I think that Richard Unekis, I think I'm saying that name right, Richard Unekis may have read this book because his novel, The Chase, was published 3 years later in 1963, and it's a heist and getaway thing with cops setting up roadblocks. And that book was adapted into a film that you guys may know called Dirty Mary, Crazy Larry, which had Peter Fonda and Susan George in it. So I think maybe Unekis read Roadblock and then sort of got an idea there of making a story all about roadblocks and a heist. I don't know. Remains to be seen. But this was the first Fred Fellows book I had read, and again, I sort of dismissed it, and I didn't really care that much about the Fred Fellows series until I started digging a little bit more into Hilary Waugh, and I wanted to try it again. The last one I'm going to tell you about real quick is the series' fourth novel, which is called Born a Victim. Now, in this one, Waugh still keeps the same blueprint of the reader being right beside Fellows the entire book. If Fellows can't see it or hear it, then the reader can't either. Again, it puts the reader right into the case, examining the clues and evidence along with the police. In this one, though, the timestamps and the dates go away. So Waugh just goes with just chapters that are numbered. This story has Fellows looking for a missing girl and just finding all sorts of crazy skeletons in the closet with the girl's wild family history. This book is dark. I mean, like really dark, and I loved this book. You're going to see reviews on the blog in the coming days for Sleep Long My Love, and then also for Born a Victim. All right, and so the Fred Fellows series, it ran 11 books from 1959 through 1968. But at the same time, Waugh was also writing other books at the time period as pseudonyms like H. Baldwin Taylor. Those books were The Triumvirate, Trouble with Tycoons, and a book called The Duplicate. During this time, he also wrote one story for The Armchair Detective. But during that 9-year period of writing the Fellows series, Waugh also wrote 5 standalone mysteries as well under his name. But then in 1968, after he said everything he needed to say about Fred Fellows, Waugh decides he wants to create another series. This one is called Homicide North. So Homicide North started with a book called 30 Manhattan East. It's a terrible title, by the way, because it's confusing with two cardinal points, and then it just doesn't make any sense. But 30 Manhattan East is the debut of the Homicide North series. There were 3 total Homicide North books. The other 2 were The Young Prey and Finish Me Off. These ran from 1968 to 1970. The 30 Manhattan East novel also appeared in the August 1968 issue of Argosy as well. With this series, it stars Lieutenant Frank Sessions and the detectives working out of the Homicide Squad in Manhattan North. Frank Sessions is 37. He likes women, food, liquor, and books, like in that order. Like his clothes, the food and liquor have to be good, but books and women he wasn't so fussy about. He's also divorced. Sessions works with detectives Eklund, Conager, and Dunford. There's also homicide sergeants in there as well, guys named Remick and Laird. These books work the same way as the first 2 Fellows books, where each chapter is a date and timestamp. So again, the reader's right there with the police on every page. The reader only knows what the police know, which I think is pretty cool. For whatever reason, I don't really know why, but the Homicide North books only ran 3 total novels. And then, after 1970, Waugh goes back and writes another 9 standalone novels through 1980, some of which were like a different genre, which we're going to talk about. So like so many mid-20th century writers, Waugh penned gothic romance novels. So you may kind of laugh that off, but I mean, you think about it, guys like Gil Brewer, John Messman, Irving Greenfield, it wasn't uncommon for those guys to write gothic romance novels because it was a hot market. The 1970s were ripe with those gothic romance novels from publishers like Fawcett Gold Medal, Avon, Paperback Library, you name it. They were all in the goth game. So for these books, Waugh used the pseudonym of Elisa Gradower, Gradower, Elisa Gradower. The names of the books, just real quick: Summer at Raven's Roost, 1976, Seaview Manor, 1976, The Secret Room of Moorgate House, 1977, Blackbourne Hall, 1979, Rivergate House, 1980. And then under his own name, he wrote another gothic called A Bride for Hampton House, which I think is more romance than goth, but you get the idea. So you can kind of see the pattern, right? Waugh would do a series, then a bunch of standalones, then another series, then standalones. So by 1980, guess what? He wants to create another series. So this is his final series. This series stars a character named Simon Kaye, Kaye. So Simon Kaye. He's a private detective. He's in New York City. He's got an office. He employs a dark-haired beauty, obviously, that serves him 10 o'clock coffee, along with doing administrative stuff. His friend is Father Jack McGuire, and the two of them play chess with each other. There's 6 total books in the Simon Kaye series. It ran from 1980 through 1986. I don't have any experience with these books, other than they all have the word case at the end, like the Glenna Powers case or the Veronica Dean case. So we were all the way up to, what does that put us at? 1986, and Waugh has 2 more novels left in his career. Murder on Safari in 1987, and A Death in a Town in 1988, which I can't remember the synopsis on A Death in a Town, but it sounds like really gory, and one of the covers on there is kind of violent, kind of violent looking. But 1 year later, I guess to celebrate his remarkable career, as I mentioned earlier, he put out that guide to writing fiction, but sort of celebrating his career, Waugh was named Grand Master by the Mystery Writers of America. He also served as president and executive vice president of Mystery Writers of America. I forgot one more tidbit. We mentioned that he did a story in The Armchair Detective and the 3 stories in Argosy. He also wrote stories for Alfred Hitchcock's Mystery Magazine, Mystery Writers Annual, Ellery Queen's Mystery Magazine, and his book The Shadow Guest appeared in Star Weekly. And on a personal note, he was married twice, had 3 children. He passed away in Torrington, Connecticut on December 8th, 2008. A remarkable career, great writer. My sources for this feature was the Fiction Magazine Index, the Stop Your Killing Me blog, of course, archive.org, and as I mentioned earlier, Hilary Wall's Guide to Mysteries and Mystery Writing.